This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, so we're venturing into a very sensitive topic this evening. And Chazal tell us that as Korach and his cohorts are being swallowed by the earth, so Korach, of course, the earth opens up its mouth, Pascha Aretz his piyah, swallows Korach, swallows his men, a fire comes down, destroys the 250 men, and yet Chazal teach us that the Bnei Korach, as they're descending into the earth, and they're losing consciousness, and they're losing cognitive function, and they're losing cardiac ability, they're losing respiratory activity, they're losing brain activity, the EEG is about to go flat. Rachash libi davar tov. Their heart stirs. Their heart stirs. Says the Medrash, why didn't they say viday? Why couldn't they say they want to do tshuva? They couldn't even talk. They were almost in the Olam HaEmes. And yet on some deep, subconscious level, their heart stirred. They wanted to do tshuva. God accepted their tshuva. And Chazal said, the Gemara says, Nispatzel hemakom beGehenom. Hashem carved out and created a special rocky crevice in the Gehenom, and they were spared. And that obviously brings us to the topic of what is considered death. What is considered Misa? There are many different definitions of Misa. Does death mean the complete cessation of cardiac activity? Does it mean the cessation of respiratory activity? Does it mean the cessation of brain function? How do we define death? So you say, what's the difference? You know, when the guy is dead, he's dead. You know it. When he, very important, makes a very big difference. Halacha l'maisa makes a very big difference. Why is that? Well, in 1968, the Harvard ad hoc criteria for death was created. The college or so-called university called Harvard came up with the following criteria: that the definition of a type of death is when the brain ceases to function. When you look at the EEG and it's flat, there's no brain activity, that is a definition of death. Now, why did they come up with this definition of death? For two important reasons. Number one, when chas v'shalom, a person is in a situation where there's no brain function, although there may be respiratory activity, the person may be breathing, and there might be cardiac activity, nevertheless, this individual cannot lead any type of productive life. He's basically there, basically a vegetable. And it creates undue burden on the hospital, on the resources of the hospital, on the resources of the taxpayers, on the family, and on the patient themselves. And therefore, in order to create something which they call death with dignity, they wanted to create a new criteria of death, which is called the Harvard ad hoc criteria for death, and that is when the brain reaches a level that there is irreversible damage, that is also considered a definition of death. Okay? That's one reason they created this criteria. Even more importantly, they created this criteria for the following reason, and that is once a person stops breathing and the pulse stops, there's no more heartbeat, it is basically almost impossible to remove organs from the body, because once there's no more breathing, once there's no more respiratory activity, and there's no more cardiac activity, very, very quickly after that, the organs stop functioning, they're no longer viable. However, if we are able to define death as the cessation of brain activity, even though the heart is still functioning and the lungs are still functioning, so this individual is breathing, his heart is pumping, but there's no brain activity, his organs are still viable. And if you would then remove his organs, this would be a very excellent source of being able to save the lives of thousands of people who are in dire need of a heart, dire need of lungs, dire need of kidneys, liver, and other organs. You see, if we don't consider brain death, so how could we remove an organ of a living entity? Basically, we're killing the person. So therefore, in order to save the lives of thousands of people, they created a new definition of death, and that's called brain death. Therefore, they are able to harvest the organs of this organism, this living creature, take out their liver, take out their kidneys, in effect, definitely ending their life. But since clinically they're already considered dead, in the medical, ethic world, it's not considered murder because this person is already clinically dead. Those were the two motives of the Harvard ad hoc criteria. Number one, to be able to spare resources, and number two, to save the lives of those in need of organ transplants. Okay. With that introduction, we begin. And what we want to look into is, what is the Torah definition of death? You may see even in Orthodox magazines where they have big advertisements for halachic organ donors. Is there such a thing? Can one be a halachic organ donor? Where, on your driver's license, there's a little check box, you want to check. Are you willing to make an anatomical gift, right? Are you willing to give up an organ? Chas v'shalom, a person is in a situation where, heaven forbid, a person is brain dead. Is that a halachic possibility, to donate an organ before the cessation of respiratory and cardiac activity? Rav Moshe Feinstein, and we jump right into the fire, and possibly the most controversial tshuva in the entire Igros Moshe. Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzaddik Levrach, in a letter to Dr. Bondi. Many may know Dr. Bondi is a pulmonologist in Kew Gardens. He's a father of a friend of mine, and he wrote a letter to Rav Moshe Feinstein in 1985 regarding the Harvard ad hoc criteria, in which Rav Moshe, writing that he had a discussion with his grandson, Mordechai Tendler, and his son-in-law, Rav Moshe Tendler, Rav Moshe seems to officially accept the Harvard ad hoc criteria that brain death is considered death. Okay? That's what it seems Rav Moshe has accepted. And we're going to just say right off the bat, this is very controversial. Tshuva number one, there's a question whether Rav Moshe even wrote the tshuva. And even if he did, there's a question what Rav Moshe meant. And what we're going to discuss today is, halacha l'maisa, this criteria is not accepted by mainstream normative psak halacha. Okay, and with this we delve into the topic. With this we begin. We start with the Mishnah Masechta Yuma. The Mishnah Masechta Yuma talks about an individual who was in some type of avalanche. A building collapsed, a house collapsed, and the Mishnah says, Misha nafla olav ma poilas, someone who a building collapsed upon them, safek husham, safek einoi sham. It's a safek if he's there, safek he might not be there. You don't know. A building collapsed, there might be somebody underneath. Safek chai, safek meis. The guy might be alive, he might be dead. Safek kusi, safek Yisrael. It might be a guy, it might be a yid. Mifakhin olav es hagal. Even if it's Shabbos, even if it's Yom Kippur, you uncover the debris, you uncover the stones. You have to discover, you have to try to check, is there a living person underneath this mapoiles? Matzu chai mefakhin. If you find the guy's alive, you continue to rescue him. Be amazed, but if he's died, yanichu, you have to leave him where he is because it's Shabbos, right? To move the stones, it's muksa, it involves malachas on Shabbos. So therefore, if it's an issue of saving a life, we know that Jewish life takes precedence even over Shabbos. But if the person is no longer alive, first you have to leave the body there on Shabbos. Okay. So now we come to the Gemara. This is the key to the whole sugya. Says the Gemara in the Masechta Yuma, Daf Pei Tanu Rabbana. How can we check to see if someone is alive? What do you do? How do you know if someone's alive? Ad heichan hu bayit. Somebody said, take $1 out of the wallet and see if he takes it, right? But no, that's not what the Gemara says, right? Ad heichan hu bayit. How do you check if someone's still alive? Ad chaytmai. Ad chaytmai. You check his nose. You check his nose. What does that mean? So Rav Moshe writes, it's an amazing thing. You take a feather, right? You put it by the nose, and you see if it moves. Basically, the same way you check if an air conditioner is working, that's how you check if the person's alive. V'yeshoimrim, and some say no, ad libai. You check his heart. You check to see if there's a pulse. If the heart is beating, the individual is alive. So we have a machlokes. The first opinion is you check his nose, you see if there's respiratory activity. The second opinion is you check his heart, you see if there's cardiac activity. And then the Gemara says the following. It says the Gemara, let's say that this machlokes is dependent on a different machlokes. What's the other machlokes? There's a question in halacha, there's a question in Jewish thought, how does God create every embryo, a living human being? Where does the creation of man begin? One man Amar says the creation begins from the head, and Abba Shaul says the creation begins from the navel, the tibor, right? The navel. Says the Gemara, the man Amar, the opinion that says that creation begins from the head. What's the head? The head is the seat of life. How is the head of the seat of life? Because the nose is what breathes. So if God created, according to the opinion that God created a human being from the head, that means life is detected in the head by the nose. The other opinion is God created man from the navel, which is the center point of the body, which is connected, so to speak, to the heart. So if God created man from the navel, then life is detected in the heart. So the machlokes, where to detect life, is dependent on how God created man. Says the Gemara, no. Really, I'll tell you, everyone agrees that God created man from the navel. Says the Gemara, God created man from the navel because whenever you create something, you start from the middle and it branches out toward the extremities. But when it comes to life, look in the Gemara number 4, says the Gemara, Ad kan lo ka'amar Abba Shaul Hasam. When does Abba Shaul say that life began at the navel? Elul inyan yitzira. That's referring to the creation of man. D'chol midi mimitziisei mitzar. Everything is created from the middle. Aval inyan pikuach nefesh. But when it comes to saving life, afilu Abba Shaul moidi. Even Abba Shaul would agree. Iker chiyusa ba'apehu. The main signs of life are detected in the nose. How do we know this? There's a pasuk. T'chsiv, koil, asher, nishmas, ruach, chayim, be'apav. Whatever has a living spirit in his nostril. The pasuk associates life with the nose. The Gemara seems to conclude everyone agrees that it doesn't matter how God created man, life is detected in the nose through respiratory activity. Again, so just to summarize, we have two opinions in the Gemara how to check the vital signs, how to determine if someone is alive. One opinion is you check his nose. Another opinion is you check his heart. The Gemara concludes that this has nothing to do with how man was created. Everyone may agree man was created from the heart. Nevertheless, the best way to tell if someone is alive is by checking their nose. Okay? If we would end the shiur right now, we would definitely have to surmise that life is dependent on respiratory activity. And there is an opinion that it's dependent on cardiac activity. What about brain function? The Gemara, the Shas, does not mention one word about the function of the brain. It's clear in Shas that even if the person's brain has stopped functioning, they're still considered alive, provided that either they have respiratory activity or they have cardiac activity. Where would you say the Gemara is inclined to where the vital signs are most noticeable? Respiratory activity or cardiac activity? Right? Reading this Gemara seems to be inclined to say life is detected through breathing, through respiratory activity. That's why the Gemara concludes, even Abba Shaul, who says that God created man through the navel, the heart, would agree that in terms of checking the vital signs, you got to check breathing. Okay? And the Rambam, likewise, the Rambam in the Parsha Mishnayos, in number 6, the Rambam seems to say, halacha l'maisa, mefakchen, what does it mean we uncover a dead body? Perush, shechoifrin, you dig, o mechabsen oisa, you search for him, uch shemagia, lechoitmai, when you reach the guy's nose, v'loi nimtza by neshama, and there's no breathing, oz, asar loylach bar yoisar, you can't dig further, the individual is dead. Concludes the Rambam, if you want to know if somebody is alive or not, you check respiratory activity. The brain is not a factor.
You just define respiratory.
Respiratory activity means breathing.
And if like chest and heart is also like very simple.
You breathe with your lungs, your pulse is your heart. There's no
The heart is respiratory.
There's no equivocation about that, right? These are the facts of life. You breathe with your lungs, and you have a pulse in your heart.
Doesn't the heart?
Everything is connected. Everything is connected, right? Even when you bang your toe, you get a headache. Everything is connected. But there's respiratory activity, there's cardiac activity, and there's brain function. Okay? They may be connected. Most often when you stop breathing, the heart will go probably very soon after, maybe a minute after. But nevertheless, it's a different function. Okay? So the Gemara seems to conclude, Rabbi say, that life is determined through breathing, through respiratory activity. Okay. Lest the person say, okay, I'll go to the patient, I'll see he stopped breathing, and, put him in the ground. Put him in the ground. So the Rambam tells us in Hilchos Avelos, not so fast. You can't just, stick the feather in the nose and it's not breathing right away, immediately bury them. The person, might be alive. Who knows? He's saying, get me out of here. You can't just check if the person is breathing, stick the feather in the nose. It doesn't, you have to wait a little bit. The Rambam writes, look in the Rambam in number 7, the Rambam writes, in Hilchos Avel, says the Rambam is talking about a goises. The goises is an individual, he's near death. Says the Rambam, very important. So you have somebody who's near death, people want to touch them, hug them, you cannot touch a goises. Says the Rambam, you touch a goises, you're a murderer. Ritzicha. You're a ritzeach. You cannot touch a goises. What is a goises like? If you like, and it's like a candle that's flickering. Once a candle is flickering, you can't touch it. We know there's a custom that when someone passes away, you close their eyes. Says the Rambam, but a goises, you're not allowed to close their eyes. Someone who closes the eyes of a goises is a roitzeach, he's a murderer. He's a murderer. Okay? Kol ha'ma'ametz im yitzias ha'nefesh ha'reza shoifech damim. Anyone who closes the eyes of a goises is a murderer. Elo yisha me'at. You need to wait a little bit. Shemanas alef. Maybe the person just fainted. But doesn't matter what condition they're in. They could be in a near-death condition. The fact that you detect no heartbeat and no respiratory activity, that you can't touch them.
What is the definition of goses? It's somebody
near
that's
death.
Moving, is bleeding, what?
Near death, near death. We're not going to get into the exact technical. So near death. Now what does it mean? What does the Rambam mean? Yishem How long do you have to wait? What is the Shiur? What is the Shiur? So the Gesher HaChaim, Rabbi Chil Michal Tukachinsky, who's the final word on Hilchos Avelos, Rabbi Chil Michal Tukachinsky says that the minhag in Yerushalayim is lahashiroi al mitasai esrim dak. You leave on the bed for 20 minutes, right, David? What's the practice of the Chaver Kadisha, right? 20 minutes. Rav Moshe also writes 20 minutes. Rav Moshe writes, I'll just tell you very quickly. Rav Moshe says, technically speaking, the feather test should do it. You stick the feather by the nose, and it's not moving. That should be enough. Because a person cannot go too long without breathing. 2 minutes, 3 minutes. But Rav Moshe says, why do you need to wait 20 minutes and repeat the feather test so many times? Because basically you need to perform the test without hesach hadas. What does hesach hadas mean? Your mind cannot be diverted. Now who can claim they could concentrate on anything for 2 minutes without diverting their mind, right? In America, everyone has ADD. Nobody could sit still and concentrate for more than 10 seconds. So Rav Moshe says, it's very possible you're holding the feather by the nose, but your mind is wandering from one thing to the next. Therefore, the test needs to be repeated many times for approximately 20 minutes, and then the doctor could sign the paper. Okay. So right now, if we would just look at the Gemara Masechta Yuma, we would have to conclude that the vital sign to be able to determine whether a person is living or not is respiratory activity. And we may then come to the erroneous conclusion that living is defined by breathing. Because if the way to tell that someone is alive is to check whether they're breathing or not, we may then come to the erroneous conclusion that the definition of life is breathing. And therefore we come to a fascinating tshuva in the Chacham Tzvi. Chacham Tzvi was the father of Rav Yaakov Emden, and the Chacham Tzvi was presented with the following question. There was a young girl who, her mother had a chicken, and the young girl, after the chicken was shechted and presented to the young girl to clean out the intestines, the kishkas of the chicken, she's cleaning out the chicken, and there's a hungry cat sitting below with his mouth wide open. He's chalishing for every piece of schmaltz. The girl throws the cat. The cat's mouth is wide open, and every time the girl throws the cat a piece of schmaltz, the cat is in seventh heaven. And all of a sudden, the girl screams out, oy vey, this animal is a treifa. This animal is not kosher. Why? Because it has no heart. Shiur, there's no heart in the chicken. There's no heart. There's no lave. And she took it to the yeshiva, and all the loimdim in the yeshiva said, this animal is a treifa. Is a treifa. By the way, this brings us to a very important halachic principle. And that is, when it comes to asking a halachic question, you cannot ask loimdim. You know what loimdim means? People who learn Torah. Just because someone learns Torah, they are not authorized to answer halachic questions. The Piskei Tshuva writes, if somebody asks a halachic question to what we call loimdim, and they tell you the wrong answer and you act based upon them, you are not a shogeg. You are not an accidental sinner. You're an intentional sinner. You need to ask the Poskim HaMeforsamim, the well-known halachic authorities. I don't care how long the guy learned. He can learn every day 100. A loimed is not a posek. Okay. So this lady asked the loimdim, and the loimdim said, the animal's a treifa. Comes Rav Yaakov, comes the Chacham Tzvi and says, what are you talking about? The animal's a treifa. There is no such thing as an animal without a heart. You can't have an animal without a heart. No living being was ever born without a heart. The girl doesn't see the heart. Either the cat chapped the heart, or the heart melted, or the heart is covered in fat. But at the end of the day, there is no, especially look at the chicken. This chicken was no different than any other chicken. The girl remembers the day before the chicken was running around the farm, making loud noises, was a geschmack of fat chicken. Now all of a sudden she claims the chicken didn't have a heart. If the chicken didn't have a heart, it would be a nebuchal chicken, it would be a shvacha chicken. It's not a shvacha chicken. It's a geschmacka chicken. It's a fat chicken. It was about to be a Yom Tov Suda. Now she wants to say the chicken didn't have a heart. There's no such thing. Says the Chacham Tzvi, life is dependent on the lave. The Chacham Tzvi continues in Shaila Ayin Zayin, in number 10, and he quotes the Arizal. And the Arizal writes that it's mefursam lakol, that the lave is the mishkan la nefesh hachiyunis. Life rests in the heart. Life does not rest in respiratory activity. Life rests in the heart. And he even quotes the Zohar HaKadosh, which observes a very interesting observation, and that is if a person was starving to death. We know if a person had no food to eat, the body would slowly consume itself in order of most expendable organ to least expendable organ. So first the body would consume its own fat cells, and then maybe a kidney, and then other organs which are not essential. What is the very last organ, says the Zohar HaKadosh, confirmed by modern science? What is the very last organ that is consumed? The lave, the heart. What does that show? Life rests in the lave. Life rests in the heart. Some want to claim that there's a sefer called Sefer Shari Shamayim that was quoting the Rambam, that life is dependent on breathing and the brain. Says the Chacham Tzvi, if anybody knows anything about the Rambam never quoted any philosophers other than Aristotle. It's well known the Rambam followed the view of Aristotle in many scientific areas. And Aristotle himself writes that life is dependent on the heart, and therefore we must conclude that is the opinion of the Rambam. Okay. Now this is very important. The Gemara Masechta Yuma. The Gemara Masechta Yuma seems to say that how do we detect life? Through respiratory activity, through the nose. Says Rav Yaakov Emden, the Gemara is a raya, pink fat-haired, exactly opposite. The Gemara is a clear raya that life is dependent on cardiac activity. What do you mean? The Gemara says you have to check the nose. Says Rav Yaakov Emden, it's a Beferish Rashi. Turn back on your sheets to number 5. Says the Chacham Tzvi. Says Rashi, what is the machlokes between the two opinions, whether you check the nose or you check the heart? Does Rashi say the machlokes is life dependent on the heart, or is life dependent on respiratory activity? Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi says the following. If you look at number 5. Mar Omar Belibai Yesh Lahavchinim Yesh Baichias. One opinion says you check the heart to see if there's vitality. Shenish Masai Doifek Esham. The life force is beating over there. Umar Amar, and the other opinion holds, Ad Chait Moi. De Zimnin de Ein Chios Nicker Belibai. Sometimes life is not detectable in the heart. V'nicker b'chait Moi, and it's detectable in the nose. Says Rashi doesn't say that the other opinion is life is not resting in the heart. No, everyone agrees life is dependent on one thing and one thing only: cardiac activity. So why does the Gemara say there's an opinion that says you check the nose? You know what the answer is? Because it's very hard to check the heart. Because first of all, the heart is covered by the chest, covered by fat, covered by the rib cage. It's very hard to detect a pulse. And even if the heart is beating, sometimes it's very faint, you can't detect a pulse. But breathing is much easier to detect. You stick the feather by the nose. So it's not that there's an opinion that life is dependent on breathing. Everyone agrees life is dependent on cardiac activity. The machlokes is, can we use a lack of pulse as an indication that there's no life? One opinion says yes. Since life is dependent on cardiac activity, just feel the heart. If there's no pulse, the person is dead. The other opinion is no. It's very hard to detect whether there's a pulse or not, and therefore the Gemara says you got to check breathing. Says the Chacham Tzvi, halacha l'maisa, life is dependent on one thing and one thing only, not brain function, not respiratory activity, cardiac activity. That is the final word of the Chacham Tzvi. Chacham Tzvi even brings down from the Ibn Ezra. You could think about whether this holds true, but the Ibn Ezra writes that the whole concept of respiration is the hot air emitted by the lungs was somehow produced by the heart. It's analogous to, when you turn on the heat of your car, where does the heat come from? The engine, right? So the hot air, which is emitted by the body, is somehow created by the engine of the body, by the heart. Okay, but in any event, the final word of the Chacham Tzvi is life is dependent on cardiac activity. Rabbi said, according to the Chacham Tzvi, if you have an individual whose heart is beating, but has lost brain function, and the doctors say this individual is clinically dead, and then you want to take out his liver to give to somebody else to save their life, what are you called? A murderer. You're called a murderer. You're called a roitzeach. It's called shvichas dam. What do you mean? The guy's life is on the line. Here you have a vegetable. Maybe they'll live another hour, and you want to take out their liver to save someone who could live for 100 years. What are you called? A murderer. A murderer. Right? Because according to the Chacham Tzvi, the final word of the Chacham Tzvi is life is dependent on cardiac activity.
Because he's alive, he's not allowed to take the organ.
What?
Because he's alive, he's not allowed
Yeah,
to take
because someone who is...
maybe alive.
He might be alive. His heart is beating. You can take out an organ, you're going to be halachically killing them. Okay? Now, probably the most authoritative tshuva that we're going to learn tonight is the tshuva of the Chassam Sofer. And we'll see that as the Chassam Sofer is writing this tshuva, this is not just written for an isolated situation. You could tell the Chassam Sofer is writing this tshuva with a sense of history, with a sense of being koiveya, the halacha, for all generations. And the Chassam Sofer is dealing with the exact opposite historical trend. You see, nowadays the medical field is trying to create a definition of death where to say that death occurs before it really does. Right? They want to say brain death is already death. In the times of the Chassam Sofer had to deal with the opposite trend, and that is, doctors were very nervous that they were burying people while they were still alive. So even after the person stopped breathing, and there was no more brain function, and they stopped having a pulse, the doctor said, we're not signing the death paper until the body begins to decompose. Can you imagine? Nowadays, they want to kill the person even before they're alive. In those days, they wanted to claim they were alive even when they were dead.
There's no insurance back then.
What? Not only that, this was not just the trend in the medical field in the times of Chassam Sofer. This was a trend in the early stages of the Reform movement, led by an individual that the Chassam Sofer calls Ramad. Rabbi Yaakov, who's the Ramad? Moses Mendelssohn. Ramad stands for Rav Moshe Dessau, Moses Mendelssohn, who the Chassam Sofer calls Ramad, Rev Moshe Dessau.
Calls him Rav?
There is a lot of revisionist history regarding his life, but at that time, that's what he was called. Okay? And he used the following argument. Moses Mendelssohn, who's considered maybe the father of the Reform movement, he maintained the following. There's a Gemara, and the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says, if you have a Nida, you have a Zav, you have someone who's Tameh. Until when are they Tameh? You know, let's say they die. Do they continue to transmit Tumas Nida, Tumas Zava, Tumas, right? Tumas Matzaira? So the Gemara says, they continue to transmit Tumah until their body decomposes. So says Moses Mendelssohn, it's a beferish raya from the Gemara, that a person is not dead, not when they stop breathing, not when they stop having cardiac activity, not when there's stop brain function, when the body decomposes. And in fact, Moses Mendelssohn brought a raya from the Rambam. The Rambam says, "Mevakrin es hamesim ad shloisha yamim." We continue to visit the dead for 3 days. Herstamaisa, you hear this? There's a mitzvah of Bikur Chaylam, right? And then there's a mitzvah of Bikur Mason for 3 days after the person's dead. Hello? You're in there? Everything okay? That's what the Rambam writes. Because they used to bury people in what we call kubin, underground labyrinths. So you gotta, what's going on? How's everything? You wanna drink? So from here, Moses Mendelssohn concluded that a person is not dead until he's dead, right? Until the worms start eating them, right? Okay. Says the Chassam Sofer. And therefore, there were some poskim who wanted to say that a kohen could be a doctor and sign death papers. Why? Because anyway, the person's not dead until 3 days later. Comes the Chassam Sofer. And first of all, the Chassam Sofer says that this is erroneous. So says the Chassam Sofer, how do we know this? Where in the Chumash does the Torah give us a definition, a halachic definition of death? Says the Chassam Sofer in the bottom paragraph in number 11, V'nechazei anan. Hine, let us see, behold, beli safek, there is no doubt. Kisha amra ha-Torah, when the Torah says, Ki yeh be'ish chet mishbat maves v'humas. The Torah says if a person is liable to the death penalty and we kill him, Loisolin, you're not allowed to leave the body hanging. What do you have to do? Ki kavar tikberenu, you need to bury him immediately. Says the Chassam Sofer, one who leaves a body, just leaves a body, he's over a mitzvah saseh of burial, he's over on a lav, Loisolin ivlasai. Says the Chassam Sofer, if the Torah is telling us we need to bury a dead person immediately, and if we don't bury immediately, we're over a mitzvah saseh and a lav in the Torah, you know what that means? That must mean God has somehow given us a halachic definition of death. Because how could God say we need to bury a mace immediately, and if we don't bury immediately, we're over an aseh, and we don't have any way to determine if somebody's dead or not? It must be, says the Chassam Sofer, there is no doubt that there is a halachic definition of death. What is the halachic definition of death? Who knows what the halachic definition of death is? Says the Chassam Sofer, either the original doctors knew.
Where's the original doctor?
The original doctors. The good ones, right? He says, even though the doctors say they don't know about this, but the original doctors know it. How do we know we follow the original doctors? It's a pasuk in Mishlei. Or, says the Chassam Sofer, even if you want to say that no doctors ever knew how to diagnose death, maybe Moshe Rabbeinu was given some type of signal, halacha l'Moshe misinai, what the definition of death is. Or, we learn it out of the pasuk, Kol Asher Ruach Chayim Ba'apai, that everything is dependent on breathing. But at the end of the day, Chassam Sofer says, there is a clinical halachic definition of death. And therefore, to wait 3 days until the body begins to rot is a violation of Kavar Tikberenu, a violation of Loisolin Ivlasai Olav. Says the Chassam Sofer, we have no doubt that there is a halachic definition of death. And therefore, Chassam Sofer concludes the following. Look in the next paragraph, the Lomar. Says the Chassam Sofer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the top. Chassam Sofer writes monumental words. Bi'al Kain, Klalhu, L'chol HaMesim. There is a great principle for all Mesim. Shezehu Shiur HaMekubal Biyadenu Me'az Haisa Adas Hashem L'goy Kadosh. That this is the determining factor from the very moment that our people have become a holy nation. That death is determined by checking breathing. V'chol haruchai sheba olam, and all the winds of the world. Any trend, any medical trend, any scientific trend, any social trend that may come. Im yimnu chafneim ruach, the world could be full of their winds. Loi yazizenu mimakoim tarasenu hakadosha. We will not budge when it comes to our tradition that death is determined by breathing. Not a moment before, not a moment later. It doesn't matter what the scientists say, what the doctors say, what the social trends are. We do not listen. We will not budge. All the winds in the world could come. V'loi yazizenu mimakoim tarasenu hakadosha. Those are the words of Chassam Sofer. And therefore, he concludes, if you see someone, in the final paragraph, that is mutal ke'even doimim, you see someone who is lying like a rock, ve'ein bo shum defika, with no pulse, v'yimachar kach bata anashima, and then there's no more breathing, ein lanu ela divrei tarasenu hakadosh shumeis, we have the tradition of the Torah, this person is no longer alive. You can't delay, and a kayin who goes and is matame is a chayte, he's a sinner. So this is the conclusion of the Chassam Sofer.
Pulse stops first and then the breathing.
What? That's because the pulse is not as detectable as the breathing. Like the Gemara says, that the final diagnosis is to see if there's breathing, because like Rashi said, it's very hard to feel the pulse behind the chazeh. So therefore, if the individual looks like he's Evan Doimim, and then there's no more breathing, only then is there Misa. Not before, not later. Not before, not later.
Why did they bring the proof from Yaakov? Because Yaakov clearly said he died and they wrapped him up.
First of all, you're not going to bring a ride from before Matan Torah, and Bechlal, the whole Indian of what they did to Yaakov Avinu was questionable. They were embalmed him. Okay, but this is the halachic definition as set forth by the Chassam Sofer, and therefore, the Tzitz Eliezer writes.
What happens if the patient is on a breathing machine?
Okay, so what if a person is artificially breathing? So there is a pulse, and there is respiratory activity, even though it's not unassisted. Now, let's talk about the following scenario. Chas v'shalom, the person is brain dead, there's no more brain activity, there's no more brain function, the EEG is flat, and the person is breathing assisted by the respirator, and there's a ventilator, and there's cardiac activity. What would the Chassam Sofer say? Presumably the Chassam Sofer would say, doesn't matter what the doctors say, it doesn't matter what the Harvard ad hoc criteria says, the definition of halachic death is the cessation of respiratory and cardiac activity. This person's heart is still beating, albeit aided by the machines. Nevertheless, this person is still breathing. To take out an organ of someone who's brain dead, the Tzitz Eliezer writes, following the Chassam Sofer's psak, to take out an organ is considered ritzicha. It's murder. It's murder.
You can kill him.
Right. You can't even touch a goysis. So you say, oh, maybe to touch a guy, for the sake of saving someone else's life. Right. You can't even touch him. Correct. Now, by the way, this is a very major controversy. And the Tzitz Eliezer writes, let's look at number 18 for a minute. Tzitz Eliezer writes, Nizda'azti, I tremble, al hisrachshiyos hamachridos b'yamim ha'ela, on the terrible happenings that are occurring nowadays. B'beis cholim Rambam b'Chaifa, in the hospital Rambam in Haifa. Lageshes b'kalas das, to approach callously. Lahash lev v'kavim me'ish Yehudi areil, to transplant the heart and the liver of a Jew to his friend. Tachas Hashem shel toirim v'nitram, and they like to mask it under the guise of donation. Donation is merely a costume for murder. Donation, toirim, yeah, he's very generous. Generosity is a costume for murder. Says the Tzitz Eliezer, look in the next paragraph. To come and bring this type of murder to Eretz Yisrael, where the Torah says, V'la'aretz lo yechupar, where the earth of Eretz Yisrael will not atone for the sin of murder. And the Tzitz Eliezer goes on to write how when the Chassam Sofer wrote his tshuva, he wrote it with a sense of history for all times, permanently establishing the halacha. The halachic criteria is death is determined by the cessation of cardiac and respiratory activity, and halacha does not recognize the cessation of brain activity. Right? Look in Ois Beis. Kfar Kava Lanu Rabbeinu Hagadol Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer has already established for us. But Shuvaisav, the Shiur Misa Kibel Moshe Rabbeinu Al Hashem Mehalach LaMoshe Misinai. And in Halacha Gimel, the Tzitz Eliezer says, and you have people that say, let's leave it up to the family, let's leave it up to the relatives, let's leave it up to the patient, right? In the Western civilization, the primary importance is given to autonomy. You should be able to make your own decision. Says the Tzitz Eliezer, your own decision. No relative can make a decision. Not even the person himself is allowed to make the decision. This is not up to our choice. This is up to the halacha. And the halacha says so long as the heart is beating, to remove an organ, that is murder. That is murder. Says the Tzitz Eliezer Nois Dalet. Al kain yesh leharish oilamoy salzeh. You need to shake the world. You need to scream and shout against this practice. And you may see advertisements for halachic organ donor. Says the Tzitz Eliezer. That's not a halachic organ donor.
Are we talking about any organ? Or, for example, a kidney? You can still survive with one kidney.
Correct.
If it goes
correct.
The eyes, and without pulling the plug.
If it's, again, if somebody is alive, so removing one of their vital organs, won't that halachically kill them? If you can't touch them even, you certainly can't remove their eye. Now, there are certain types of transplants that can be done after halachic death, maybe a skin type of graft, but we're not discussing that this evening, okay? And therefore the Chassam Sofer says in Ois Hey, Asher al kain ha'choiva al roya Yisrael. The obligation on all Jewish leaders, the al komisha b'yadei lasos, and anyone who could act, leman menias ritzichas nefashos b'masve refues. You need to prevent murder under the guise of medicine. Murder under the guise of medicine. Lamed ala mitzvah, to stand strong, ulahazer al inyan hacham razeh. Okay. And because of this, the Tzitz Eliezer published letters from the Shas Teshuvos Minchas Yitzchak saying that to remove an organ on someone who is brain dead, it is murder. As well as printing a letter from the Shas Teshuvos Shevet HaLevi, the Vazner, that removing an organ from someone who's brain dead is murder. And he also, in Chilek Yotes, look at number 19, Tzitz Eliezer published a letter in unison from Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zecher Tzaddik Levracha, and Lahavda Ben Chaim L'Chaim, the Paisek Adar, Reb Yosef Shalom El Yashiv, Ron Shem Shesem Refu Shalema. And they both, Kulam Anu V'Yamru. Look what they write in number 19. Nizbakashnu Legalois Datenu. We were requested to reveal our opinion. Das Torah. Be'inyan hashsalas halev shari varam l'tzar chola mesukim bizman shalev toireim payim u'moichoy koilo geza amoich enam espakakla. Regarding an individual who is in grave danger. His heart is beating, but his brain, including the brain stem, is not functioning at all, which is misa samoyach datenu. Our opinion, says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, says Rabbi Yashiv. She'ein shum heter lahaitzi af echad min evarach. You cannot remove any one of the limbs. And if you do, v'yesh b'zeh mishum shvichas damim. If you do, it is considered murder. By the way, Rabbi Yashiv was asked by the Dayanim in London, can you carry around a card that says you're a donor? No, of course not. Of course not. So some say, well, if you can't donate, then you can't receive. How do you have a right to say to the world, we don't donate but we receive? The answer is, we say we are not murderers, right? And we cannot donate our organs. You want to give it to us to save a life? That is your business. But it is not a contradiction. It's not one without the other. We may receive, but we can't donate. Now in Eretz Yisrael, you can't receive either. You can't receive an organ in Eretz Yisrael either, the Paiskim, right? Because who are you receiving it from? You're receiving it from another Jew. The majority of people in Eretz Yisrael are Jewish, so to receive an organ from someone in Eretz Yisrael, so you're assisting in murder, right? Okay. And therefore, the Sefer Nishmas Avram, the Nishmas Avram was written by Rabbi Avram, Dr. Avraham S. Abraham, who is one of the Talmidim of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he writes the following. First he writes in number 20, he lists other Gedolei Hadar who also do not accept brain death. They are Rabbi Yitzchak Weiss, the Menchas Yitzchak, Reb Vosmer, the Shevet HaLevi, Reb Avadia Yosef, and Rav Shach, coupled with Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Reb Yashiv. And therefore he concludes the following. The consensus of opinion of the Gedolei Hadar is that a brain-dead patient is not dead. He cannot be used as a donor, even to save the life of a seriously ill patient. As the halacha stands, it is forbidden to be either a donor or a recipient of organs in Eretz Yisrael from a brain-dead patient. It is permitted to be a recipient in the diaspora. That is the consensus of the Paiskim, right? It's clear.
What about Nagoy?
What?
It's a goy.
What do you mean if it's a goy?
But donated with a goy.
If you know it's a goy, then you can take it.
What if the patient is dead?
Oh,
He's still allowed to...
if somebody's halachically dead, you can't get the organs are no longer viable.
No, but he's saying within the time period.
Not after. Nowadays,
There is a window.
There's a window of time.
There is a window.
so if there's a window, there's a window. Then you're involved in the following issue of what we call nivel hames. That the same way we don't do an autopsy, to remove an organ, we won't do. Now, to save a life, you can. But Noida Behuda has already established the following principle. That when it comes to nivel hames, it is only permitted if you have someone in front of you who needs it immediately. But to put in a freezer somewhere to preserve it for someone who may need it, that's prohibited. Okay? If there is a window, it seems that for most organs there is no window. But,
That's what we're doing right now at NYU.
okay, if somebody is completely clinically dead, respiratory activity, cardiac activity, then and there's a window, then and there's somebody in front of you who needs it right here and now, then it would come out that it should be permitted, right? Okay. Because it's Hatzos Nefesh, Pikuach Nefesh. Because that's no longer considered halachically Pikuach Nefeshos. Maybe in the future something will. What? You don't know. Right? If it's not in front of you, it's not considered Pikuach Nefeshos. That's the famous guidelines of the Noida Behuda. Okay.
Nowadays, 20-minute time, we have to wait 20 minutes.
Yeah, so you're going to have to wait 20 minutes.
Now technology right now, we can say for sure.
So what's amazing is, with all the technology that's available today in determining when death is, how do we know when somebody dies? It's a good old feather test. With all the technology. But Moshe Feinstein writes, the way to know somebody died, you need to wait 20 minutes. 20 minutes. That's the shear. Now, 20 minutes, I don't think you're getting any organ, right? But that's the shear that the minog and Klal so that you wait 20 minutes. Now, let's just spend a few minutes about the controversy with Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe, if you remember, going back to that original tshuva, Rav Moshe seemed to accept this criteria of the Harvard ad hoc definition of death, which is brain death, which perhaps one could be led to think that would mean that you could take the organs out of someone who is brain. Now, I found a very interesting thing. First of all, we explained that I spoke to a very big posek today, this afternoon. Rabbi First in Chicago said Rav Moshe never said this. Rav David Feinstein says Rav Moshe also never said any type of organ transplant is permitted. That's what I clarified today. What?
We should take it out of the sacred, no?
I won't comment on that. But Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach writes the following on this letter, and that is, even if Rav Moshe did accept the Harvard ad hoc criteria, says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, we are forced to say the following. Just because Rav Moshe is defining death, maybe is agreeing to this criteria, he is only agreeing to that criteria for limited circumstances, and that is regarding DNR, do not resuscitate. That if you know someone is clinically dead, they have no brain function, and the respirator no longer has oxygen in it, and now you want to know, should you put them back on the respirator? That's what Rav Moshe meant to say, that will accept the Harvard definition. Because we're not clear that this person is alive. We don't know for sure. So we may not have to extend ourselves to proactively save their life. But to go ahead and to take out an organ from this individual who might be alive, of course, Rav Moshe would agree, says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, to all the poskim that removal of an organ is murder. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman, you know how I know this? Because Rav Moshe himself wrote in a tshuva that removal of a heart transplant, by the way, the first heart transplant was by some South African doctor, right, in 1965. So Rav Moshe writes that heart transplant is murder of both parties. Both of the person you're removing the heart from and the person you're putting the heart in. Rav Moshe said he's better off with his bad heart than the new one. Okay, nowadays they've improved that technology. But nevertheless, Rav Moshe is on record of saying you can't do transplants. If Rav Moshe changed his mind, then when he wrote his tshuva, accepting the Harvard ad hoc criteria, then don't you think he would have said that nowadays transplants are permitted, especially because Rav Moshe wrote that second tshuva in the heat of the transplant debate? Why did he not comment about it? Says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that is because Rav Moshe continued to maintain his opinion that a transplant is murder, agreeing to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rabbi Yashiv, the Shevet HaLevi, the Tzitz Eliezer, the Minchas Yitzchak, Rav Adi Yosef, Rav Shach, and Rav Kulitz, that they all agree that this is Ritzicha. And that is, we will end this evening. That the consensus of the poskim is that to sign some kind of document agreeing to give up an organ is not halachically acceptable. Now let's come back to Parshas Kairach.
What are you supposed to do yourself? How you can act against this organ problem?
But,
Okay, don't sign on the.
For now, the first thing is to know the correct approach. Okay, we'll just conclude with the following. Back to where we started, the Bnei Kairach. It's very interesting. The language of the Medrash in demonstrating and stating that the Bnei Kairach are still alive is what? Rachash, Libi, Davar Taiv. The Medrash is explaining that in their last moments of life, when all other functions have failed, which function is still existing? The Leiv, which is exactly what the Chacham Tzvi says. The Mishkan Hachios is in the Leiv, and that is the conclusion. Halacha l'maaseh. Rabbi, have a great evening.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.